Section 3.3, Measures of Central Tendency and Dispersion from Group Data. The objectives of this lesson is that for number one, you're going to approximate the mean and standard deviation of a variable from grouped data, and then we're going to compute the weighted mean. Now, we have discussed how to compute descriptive statistics from raw data, but often the only data available have already been summarized in frequency distributions called group data. Although we cannot find exact values of the mean or standard deviation without raw data, we can approximate these measures. So objective number one, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to approximate the mean of a variable from grouped data. Because raw data cannot be retrieved from a frequency table, we assume that within each class, the mean of the data values is equal to the class midpoint. And then multiply the class midpoint. Again, the class midpoint is the sum of consecutive lower class limits divided by 2 by the frequency. This product is expected to be close to the sum of the data that lie within the class. You repeat the process for each class and add the results. And this sum approximates the sum of all the data. Here's the approximate the mean of a variable from a frequency distribution. Okay, we have our population mean and we have our sample mean. So remember, the population mean has the symbol mu. The sample mean has x bar. So they're going to be the same formulas. It's just remember that the difference between population mean and sample mean. Okay. Now, if we take a look here, to find the population mean, we need to take the midpoint, which is x subscript I. Now, x subscript I is the midpoint or the value of the ith class. Okay, it's the same thing over here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to multiply it by the frequency of each class. And then we're going to add them up. And that's how we get the numerator. Okay, and then we're going to divide it by the total of the frequencies. So this is the total of the frequencies. And recall that n is the number of classes. So that means you're going to take midpoint 1, multiply it by frequency 1, plus midpoint 2 times frequency 2, plus and so on, to the nth midpoint times the nth frequency divided by the total frequencies. Now, in each formula, the midpoint times the frequency approximates the sum of all the data values in the first class. And then the midpoint of 2 in the frequency of 2 approximates the sum of all data values in the second class, and then so on. And notice that the formulas for the population mean and sample mean are essentially identical, just as they were for computing the mean from raw data. Okay, now let's take a look at an example. Approximating the mean for continuous quantitative data from a frequency distribution. The frequency distribution in the table below represents the 5-year rate of return of a random sample of 40 large blend mutual funds. We want to approximate the mean 5-year rate of return. The first column is the class of the 5-year rate of return. The second column is the frequency, the midpoint, and then the last column is taking the midpoint and multiplying it by the frequency. So what's given is the class and the frequency, and we need to figure out the midpoint and the midpoint times the frequency. So let's take a look at the first row. Okay, so our class is going from 8 to 8.99. We know that we have a frequency of 2. In order for us to find the midpoint, we need to take the midpoint, which is 8, and then add 9, and divide that by 2, which gives us a midpoint of 8.5. So we have our midpoint of 8.5, and we have our frequency of 2. So we're going to take our frequency of 2 in the last column and multiply it by the midpoint, which is 8.5, which gives us a total of 17.0. Okay, the next class we have 9 to 9.99. So we know that we have a frequency of 2. So we're going to multiply that by 2, and then we got to find the midpoint. Well, the midpoint is taking the 2 lower class limits, 9 plus 10, divided by 2 gives us 9.5. So 2 times 9.5 is going to give us 19.0. Okay, and then we're going to continue on. We're going to take the midpoint. Again, the frequency is 4. Okay, and we're going to take 4, and then we're going to multiply it by the midpoint. And the midpoint is 10.5. We multiply those together, we get 42.0. Okay, next we have 11, 11.99. So what is the midpoint there? 11 plus 12 divided by 2 gives us 11.5. We have a frequency of 1. So we're going to take a frequency of 1 and multiply by its midpoint to get 11.5. Next, we have the class 12 to 12.99. We know the frequency of that is 6. To find the midpoint, 12 plus 13 divided by 2 gives us 12.5. So we're going to multiply the frequency 6 times the midpoint of 12.5 to give us 75.0. Next, we have 13 to 13.99. We know that the frequency is 13. We can determine that the midpoint is going to be 13 plus 14 divided by 2, which is 13.5. So we're going to take our frequency of 13, multiply it by the midpoint of 13.5 to give us 175.5. Next, we have the class 14 to 14.99. We have a frequency of 7. We can see that our midpoint is 14.5. We take our frequency of 7, multiply it by the midpoint of 14.5 to get 101.5. Okay, next class we have 15 to 15.99. We have a frequency of 3, and we have a midpoint of 15.55, so we're going to take that frequency of 3 and multiply it by 15.5 to get 46.5. Okay, next class, we have 16 to 16.99. We know that we have 1 for the frequency. We know that we have 16.5 as the midpoint. And when we multiply them together, then we get 16.5. 17 to 17.99. We know that we have a frequency of 0. We know our midpoint is 17.5. If we take 0 and multiply it by 17.5, we're going to get 0. Likewise, for class 18 to 18.99, we have a frequency of 0. Our midpoint is 18.5. Take 0 and multiply it by the midpoint of 18.5, and that gives us 0. Okay, next, class 19 to 19.99. We have a frequency of 1. We know that our midpoint is 19.5. So 1 times 19.5 gives us 19.5. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, we got to find some totals, okay? So the totals, we're going to add up all the frequencies. So when we add up all the frequency, we're going to get 40, okay? And then when we add up the total of the last column, which is the midpoint times the frequency, then we get 524. So now we're going to use our formula. So to approximate the mean, okay, we're going to use our formula. And then what's our formula? Well, let's go ahead and do that. So let's take a look at the formula. So the formula to find the mean is to take the total of the last column, which we know, and we're going to divide that by the total of the frequency. So let's go ahead and do that. So we know that the numerator is going to be 524, and then we're going to divide that by the denominator, which is 40. Okay, so if we go ahead and do that in our calculator, let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to take 524, we're going to divide that by 40, which gives us 13.1. So therefore, we would say that the approximate mean 5-year is 13.1%. So the mean 5-year rate of return from the raw data is 13.141%.